as promised, joining us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, 97.3 ESPN Phillies insider Frank Klose. Phillies are back on the field. Well, kind of. Whether you want to call it spring training 2.0 or summer camp, Frank Klose has all the coverage over at 97.3 ESPN.com. You follow on Twitter at Frank Klose with a K. Frank, how you doing on this Saturday?
I'm well. Happy 4th.
Happy 4th of July, Frank. I appreciate you jumping on the holiday today.
Oh, not a problem. Always good to talk baseball, especially since we have some.
Well, speaking of, there is baseball. So first of all, is this spring training 2.0? Is this summer camp? Is this summer at the ballpark? What are we really referring to this? Watching Bryce Harper hit bombs at Citizens Bank Park.
Well, when we took our first media Zoom call with Matt Klentak earlier in the week, they made it clear that this would be called summer camp. So I think they actually have an official name for it, and they call it summer camp.
All right, well, there you go. That answers that question. So with that being said, my initial question to you, Frank, is we see the players out there. What can we really expect from them, though, when the season resumes? Because one of the things I don't think we've talked about enough, because we all know the reason why everything got shut down was COVID-19, but one of the side effects of that is all of these players are walking into a complete unknown, Frank. So what can we really expect from the Phillies when games do resume?
Well, here's a really funny thing. Nobody really knows. In fact, Major League Baseball still hasn't made a lot of decisions yet as to how this is going to proceed. What we don't know yet is what the schedule is going to be, of course, even though that's less than 3 weeks from now. Supposedly there's a baseball season. And we don't know if there's going to be any type of we usually have the Grapefruit League action where the teams scrimmage against other teams. We don't know if there's going to be any Baltimore Orioles bus trips to Philadelphia or Phillies bus trips to Baltimore. There's so much that's not decided, even a lot of ins and outs contractually as to how they're going to take care of service time in terms of how long a player is in the big leagues, which, of course, affects some of the prospects because, like the Alec Boehms and Spencer Howards, if they didn't come up until close to May, then they would have been this would not have counted as a full year towards their contract. So there's all these little things that need to be worked out. And right now, all you're getting is just players taking batting practice in Citizens Bank Park. And here's the funny thing, too, because the media, they're only allowed to be in the upper levels of Citizens Bank Park right now. They're not allowed on the side fields like down at the park, and in Allentown and Coca-Cola Park where they're playing. So it's right now there's just this unknowingness as to what's going to kind of happen, and how do you take batting practice at Citizens Bank Park, which is fine because we all know Bryce Harper can hit bombs at batting practice. We've seen him do it a million times. But how does that translate into game action? And is anybody going to be ready for game action? And then you got to get to the point where, a lot of these players that have tested positive aren't reporting to their respective summer camps. So are they going to play? Then who's going to test positive during the season? Or who's going to happen to walk by somebody who tested positive and then they can't play? This is such a free-for-all in so many respects. We just learned that Freddie Freeman of the Braves is one of the ones on the COVID list. And, of course, the Phillies have 4 key players on their COVID list. As Matt Breen reported, that Scott Kingery, who, of course, was going to be the starting second baseman, and Hector Neris, the presumed closer, Ranger Suarez, candidate for the starting rotation. Those are 3 key pieces that you were going to have. Now, we knew about Tommy Hunter previously. Hopefully that means he's closer to recovery. But he's somebody who could be a key bullpen piece, especially when you're without Hector Neris. So this season is just going to kind of unfold as it unfolds, and it's really going to be unpredictable. And it'll be very interesting to see when this is all said and done, who makes the playoffs, because, it really is a free-for-all.
Now, speaking of the free-for-all, if we can just talk for a moment about the players testing positive for COVID-19. So I saw the report just a couple minutes ago before you came on, Frank, that Freddie Freeman doesn't feel so good. But we know other situations where players test positive and they say, I feel perfectly fine. I don't feel like there's anything wrong with me. So what is the procedure for the players to come back, considering some of them may test positive and they have no symptoms, and another player may test positive and they have symptoms?
Yeah, I think it's going to have to be on a case-by-case basis. Is it good enough if a player takes, let's say he tests positive and has no symptoms, but then a week later he tests negative twice? Like, is that enough to clear him to play? That's kind of the great unknown right now, and I don't think that they've totally made those ins and outs of any type of like public declaration that's precise, because, as you said, some have symptoms, some don't. We've seen some people have symptoms for a long period of time. For some people, they get it for a few days, it's gone, and eventually, they can test negative again, and then they have the antibody. So this is, and I think part of the problem is, even the science of this is completely unknown. So it's not like this is something where we have it totally figured out as a society. They're still learning more about the virus every single day. And for a lot of these players, I think they need to basically just go on a case-by-case basis and make sure, one, that they're feeling okay, two, that the ones that were sick, if you've ever had any type of illness and you've just not been very active for a week or two, of course, you think about the athlete and what's going to be necessary to get them back in physical shape. This is going to be, I think it's going to be unique to every single player. So, even if you test negative, that doesn't mean you're ready to go. If you've had some of the symptoms where you might be dehydrated, or you haven't been able to work out in any way whatsoever, that could be an individual recovery that could take weeks.
And Frank, just correct me if I'm wrong, but you have to test negative twice in order to be cleared to do any type of resumption of activities, correct?
I believe that's the case, yes.
So if someone, and I'm just throwing out a scenario, okay, because I'm not saying this is going to happen, so nobody freak out, but just so I want to paint this so everybody understands what's going on, Frank. So let's say that the season starts and Zach Eflin tests positive, and then he gets quarantined, and then in order for him to resume, he has to test negative twice, and that could take 10 days, 15 days, who knows how many days. So in essence, a player like Eflin, a pitcher, may miss, of their 10 to 12 starts, 2 or 3 in the process of all of this.
That's very much the case, and since you mentioned the starting pitcher, Joe Girardi was talking about on his Zoom call that they kind of had this idea of like a three-tier rotation, so that you have at least 2 arms behind the presumed starter that can jump in on that 5th day. So for in other words, let's say Vince Velasquez and Nick Pivetta aren't in the starting rotation, Spencer Howard is. You might have Vince Velasquez set to be behind Nola, and maybe even as the season's early, if they're both healthy, Velasquez backs up Nola and maybe covers some of the middle innings as he gets his stamina going. And then you have somebody hanging out in Lehigh Valley, like a Cole Irvin, for example, or an Enyel De Los Santos, who might not be on the roster, that can come down from Allentown and start as well. So it seems like they're trying really hard to have many, many options. Every team's going through this, and that's why I think this season is going to be so interesting, is because, let's say you're the Phillies and you head down to Atlanta and their best starter happens to be thrown on the COVID list. Maybe they're totally fine, but they bumped into somebody who had it, and they have to quarantine. Well, then what? Like, the whole game is completely changed, Or think about them coming into Philly. If you're coming in expecting to face Aaron Nola and you end up facing Vince Velasquez instead, that's very, very different. So it could be a matter of luck. Hopefully once this thing gets going and all the players have reported, they've done their inbound screenings, hopefully at that point they can pretty much control where they are and who they're talking to and where they're going. And because once you interfere with that, then you'll have problems. Now, it's kind of funny. The Toronto Blue Jays, they did allow them to go up to Canada and play. They actually are staying in the hotel in the Rogers Center, which is, if fans don't know, there's actually a straight hotel inside the ballpark there.
Right.
You can actually see the games from the ballpark. So the Toronto Blue Jays will be very well kept under lock and key because they will just walk from their hotel room down to the field.
Frank Klose joining us here on the Boardwalk on the hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Follow him on Twitter at Frank Klose. our 97.3 ESPN Phillies insider, also co-host of the Powder Blue podcast with Jeff Mosher and Hunter Brody. Frank, let's focus on that pitching staff because we just talked about it a little bit. We all assume your 1, 2, 3 starters in some variation are Nola, Wheeler, and Arrieta. But what about the final 2 slots? I feel like there's a possibility for maybe Spencer Howard from what has been inferred by the Phillies. I feel like there might be a possibility for Velasquez to kind of be the backup starter. What do you expect the Phillies' rotation and pitching staff to look like if all things are equal?
Well, I think that will be totally decided once the rules are figured out. For example, a player, if 1/6 of the season staying out of the roster was good enough to not count as a year, well, then maybe you would just wait 10 days for Spencer Howard to come up. I think once Spencer Howard is at the point, provided he looks good, provided he stays away from the COVID list for whatever reason, I think Spencer Howard will be the 5th starter once you know the roster situation. And I think they'll try to make sure they don't burn a whole year here if it's simple enough, like sitting out 10 games, or a week or whatever it ends up being. But I would say the other 4 are a lock: Aaron Nola, Zack Wheeler, Jake Arrieta, Zach Eflin. I think they're locked in. And the 5th will go to Spencer Howard as soon as they can make that roster decision. And of course, they're without Ranger Suarez right now, who was a lefty candidate for the starting rotation and actually pitching pretty well down in Clearwater. So you don't know if he's going to factor in, at least in the interim. But in the meantime, if Spencer Howard is not there, I'll probably be on that group in Lehigh Valley area, working out up there and ready to jump in as soon as he gets a moment. So I think the thing about this shortened season is you really want to maximize the talent you have, especially when you consider that somebody could be up or down any day. So I think that the Phillies want Spencer Howard in there, but I think they won't give up a year's control if it's just a matter of a week, 10 days.
Speaking of maximizing talent, I was talking about this earlier, and I'm curious what your perspective on this, Frank, because you've been watching this Phillies team for a while. You've been hyper-focused on this team. I'm curious what's up with Jake Arrieta. And the reason I say that is because if Jake only gets like 10, 12 starts in this miniature season, Frank, we've seen Jake look really good for short spurts, and other short spurts look really bad. So how much could what version of Jake Arrieta could implode or elevate this Phillies team?
Well, I think the good news is if you look at last season, and even the season before that, Arrieta started out strong and then sort of trailed off as time went on. I mean, maybe it's his age. I mean, he is 34 years old now. I'm thinking that if you sort of let Jake Arrieta loose and it's a shortened season, he may make 10 starts or 12 starts, even including the playoffs, depending on how things lay out, then he might be healthy the whole way, and then he might be productive the whole way. Looking at his numbers when things. Now, I previously looked at. I'm trying to remember if I did that when it was 60 games or 72 games. Along the way, I was looking at the numbers, but he definitely had a winning record before that one moment where it seemed to fall off. He might have been like 7-5 in the span of 60 games or something like that. And he even pitched some good games last year. I can think of one start. He went 8 innings. Might have allowed a couple runs, but he looked like the old Jake Arrieta. But then, of course, once you got into like June, July, he just sort of fell off a little bit. So hopefully they get a good big bang for their buck this season because somebody like him doesn't have to give you that longevity, and he can just sort of let it loose. And I think that actually is an advantage for the Phillies that Arrieta is in a shorter season.
Yeah, the first 12 starts of last season, he went 6-6. But the thing that gets overlooked, Frank, is the fact that he actually did pitch well overall, despite the fact he had the record of 6-6. So, to me, I think that there might be, like you said, an opportunity for the Phillies to maximize that talent. And maximizing talent. How about the new guy, Zack Wheeler? I mean, we were so interested and intrigued when the Phillies signed him. Well, what will he look like in this shortened season? Because he's another guy who, for stretches of time, looks really good, and other times doesn't look so good.
Well, I think he's looked really good once he got healthy the last couple seasons with New York. So I think he was definitely trending in the right direction. One thing that we should be aware of at some point, and now for how long we'll see. His season will be interrupted. He is due to have a child, and he probably will hit the paternity list in the middle. I don't know the exact due date of the child, but hopefully that's done in a way where he doesn't end up on the COVID list too because he walked down the wrong hallway in the hospital. But aside from that, I think he's going to give the Phillies a lot. I mean, there were a lot of teams interested in Wheeler because they really did see that he was trending in the right direction, and the Phillies were able to get him because his wife's from New Jersey, and he wanted to be near her home, and the White Sox offered more money because they really believed in him as well, and but he chose the Phillies anyway. So I do think that there's a lot of talent there. The Phillies were kind of interested in him a couple years ago when there was rumors he would be traded. Mets didn't pull the trigger, and after that, he pitched very, very well for the Mets. And it's like the Mets were wise to hold on to him for as long as they did. I thought they should have traded him last year at the trade deadline since he was going to be a free agent. But yeah, he's been going in the right direction, and I think that Wheeler will give the Phillies something for their money. I mean, they paid handsomely for him, but they really needed a reliable starter. And based on what I saw with him with the Mets the last couple of years after the injury, I think he's going in the right direction.
Frank, let's flip it over to the conversation about the guy who catches these pitchers. That's JT Realmuto. Matt Klintak's comments were very bizarre, to say the least, about JT Realmuto earlier this week. And then you have Bryce Harper wearing a JT Realmuto shirt jersey while he's working out, almost kind of sending a message to the organization of like, hey, I support this guy. So, what do you think ultimately is going to happen with the JT Realmuto contract situation?
I think they have a chance to get something done. I know that the Phillies have to say all the right things publicly. They did those intake screenings over the weekend. And, the way Matt Klintak described it on our Zoom call on Monday was like, hey, I've spent the weekend. We've only been allowed to negotiate since Friday, and I've spent Friday till now just working on the intake screening. So there is a new financial reality here. I tend to think that new financial reality benefits the Phillies because, let's face it, teams are going to probably lose money this year. Again, I say probably because we don't know the full extent of that yet. And there might be less competition for his services in the free agency this year. So I think that if JT Realmuto can, kind of takes a look at a really good offer from the Phillies, he may not want to roll the dice. There's a chance of a strike in 2022. If anything's an indication from these labor disputes in the last few weeks, it looks like they could be headed towards some further labor unrest. And you know what? If he could sign a deal where he gets some of his signing bonus paid out on 2022 just to protect him in case there's no income that year because of the strike, I think he can. I think it's a good idea for JT Realmuto to take it because for every team that's lost money, that's fewer dollars in the free agency pool. Now the question will be mainly which of the big money teams will be looking for someone like Realmuto. That's the only thing that might worry you a little bit because, the Yankees were interested in trading for him reportedly. There were some rumors that they were even willing to part with Gary Sanchez for him in a trade. And this way they can keep both of them, keep Sanchez's bat and have Realmuto if they can just sign him. But the Yankees might be too maxed out on contracts. The Boston Red Sox were kind of maxed out on contracts before all this hit, and they were trying to cut some money this year. So I think if you look at everything, Realmuto could probably say, you know what, if the Phillies are still offering good money now, it's probably not worth the risk going to free agency right now. And that kind of leads me to think that they're going to get something done. And the one thing that we keep hearing is how much John Middleton loves Realmuto. And if you're the one who decides how to spend the money, you usually get what you want.
You kind of open the door for the financial conversation. This is something you and I have talked about previously, Frank, which is, baseball made $10 billion last year. And apparently they're only going to have $3 billion in revenue this year. They claim they're losing $4 billion. What is going to be the domino effect of all that? Because obviously the main reason why these sports are taking this calculated risk of returning is because of the financial aspect of things. So in the future, what could be the windfall from that if you keep having less and less revenue? How does that fall down to the players and their salaries and how money does get spent around baseball?
Yeah, eventually you would think it does trickle down a little bit. And even if you say, all right, well, the Yankees will still pay a lot and swoop in and get the best free agent, well, then what happens to the second-tier players? They're not going to be getting as much as they were. Like, we were just off an off season that was it was really historic for the amount of money given in free agency. When you look at all the different contracts that were signed, especially the one like Garrett Cole got from the Yankees, the money, it was just through the roof. And this off season coming up, besides Realmuto, you have Mookie Betts hitting the free agent market. There's only going to be so much money to go around, and it really depends on how teams plot their course forward, and whether or not major. Now, there's one wild card here that I'll just kind of throw out here. There has been talk for a long time about expansion, and if you expand to 2 more teams, you can sell 2 franchises that are $2 billion each. Well, there's your $4 billion shortfall just made right up. Now, granted, a lot of those owners wanted to put that in their pocket, but it's like anything, like any other industry that's affected right now. You have to try to do what you can until you can overcome this. At some point, that they will be able to overcome this. Franchise values have historically gone up 10.7% from a period from 1991 to 2017. That was the rate of value increase for Major League Baseball teams. So you got to think that they'll be able to recover. It's kind of a short-term issue where they'll quote unquote lose money because they spent more than they made or that it came in for the season. But at the end of the day, if their franchise value goes up, did they really lose money, so to speak? So they might have had a negative cash flow, but they might still technically have made money because their franchise is worth more. So I think this is kind of a temporary blip. I think the Mookie Bettses of the world, they're going to get big money because someone like Mookie Betts will get a 12-year contract or a 13-year contract. We'll be in the Harper Machado type deal range when this is all said and done. And I'm sure that the team that signs him will just say, okay, well, we're losing some money these next couple of years. But at the end of the day, you're not going to pay. You're not going to pay for a middle of the road kind of guy like you otherwise would, and that's probably temporary, but it is a reality. And we'll have to see how Major League Baseball and the Major League Baseball Players Association sort of work this out in the future. But the big names will get money, but there still will be less in the pot, at least in terms of cash flow in the immediate future. But there's still plenty of time for them to make that up.
Now, we know that with the DH being instituted, obviously that's got to be something that some of the players and the Player Association like because it, quote-unquote, gives guys more jobs, unquote. Obviously that can be twisted one way or the other. But for the Phillies, Frank, I'm assuming that they're going to do what a lot of teams do, according to what Klentak said, which is they're going to mix and match. Some games it may be Bruce, some games Hoskins, some games Realmuto. Maybe you mix in Alec Baum if he gets some playing time. So is that basically the idea, what I'm saying, which is the Phillies are going to use the DH as a mix and match opportunity?
Yeah, and that seems to be what most teams are doing anymore. I mean, if you look at the American League, there's very few straight designated hitters anymore. We're beyond the era of Big Papi. Nelson Cruz is there still mashing home runs in Minnesota as the designated hitter. But other than that, you're talking about a kind of a I don't want to say the word defunct, but people use the DH differently than they used to. It used to be when your big slugger had bad knees, well, then that's where he goes and he still hits a lot. But Major League teams have tended to use it as the place to sort of rest guys along the way. And a lot of American League teams, they might have somebody like a Jay Bruce, that the Phillies luckily have, who can maybe fill that role one day. Maybe he can play first base one day. Maybe he can play the outfield for a day. And then maybe that there's a day where the catcher who can hit, like JT Realmuto that the Phillies have, serves as a designated hitter to save his knees a little bit behind the plate. So I think I think teams that really use it as a means of rest tend to do better than teams that just sort of declare that so and so is a designated hitter and stick with it. It just doesn't seem to make sense because this is a game that, let's face it, that they are taking fewer supplements, to put it gently, than they used to, and the body needs time to recover. And the one way you can do that is not have to go out in the field, particularly when you're a catcher or in another high stress position. So I think that's actually the smart way to do it. I think the Phillies are set up to be able to do a lot of things. Again, because of the versatility of Jay Bruce, because Alec Boehm could come up, and they haven't really tried him yet at other positions, but certainly Gene Segura is somebody who can play multiple positions. Scott Kingery can play multiple positions. There's so much that the Phillies can do with that designated hitter. So I think that the way they should approach it best is look at matchups, look at who needs a day, and just figure out when JT Realmuto is going to be behind the plate, when he's going to be the designated hitter, and then build the rest around that.
He is Frank Klose. Follow him on Twitter at Frank Klose, our 97.3 ESPN Phillies insider, co-host of the Powder Blue podcast, and more. As all guests, he joined us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline. Frank, thanks again for joining me on the 4th of July, and hopefully, seeing the Phillies out there will lead us to actual Phillies games later this month.
It will be here before we know it. Happy 4th, Josh.